Welcome to the panel. We're talking about the blue-collar agenda, and that's one of the things that's near and dear to my heart. I've been writing about the need for people on the center-right to reach out to blue-collar voters for over a decade, and how that outreach requires a different mindset than the mindset that is typical on the various factions of the right. And we have some wonderful people here to talk about that. And what I'd like to do is just get started to hear what your ideas are, and then we will move into a type of discussion. So, Judge, what do you think people ought to be, what do blue-collar voters need in terms of policy? What are there distinctions between type of blue-collar voters? What should we be thinking about as we're trying to think about how to provide what people who are not going to get a four-year college degree need in order to thrive in American society?
Thanks. So I kind of think this is three main things that the conservative movement should definitely focus on in terms of reviving the fortunes of the blue-collar class. And one is obvious because they say it all the time when you ask them. It's inflation. Seems very clear. I wrote about the Wall Street Journal last year, the old kind of semi-conservative myth of the wage price spiral, that somehow increased inflation leads wages to go up, which leads unions to get more powerful, is a myth. What we've learned in the past year is inflation causes wages to spiral down, which is exactly what happens in the 1970s and is happening again now. We've lost, despite the most recent inflation reading, about 3% of real wages in a year. We're approaching what was happening in the Great Recession in 2008. And so that's simple. We should do something standard like an aggregate spending growth measure for the Federal Reserve, and we should do something like New Zealand, where they just fire the guy if he doesn't hit it. Clear as day. You have one job if you're the Federal Reserve. If you're failing at it, you get out. That's simple. That'll help a lot of blue-collar types immensely. Now, the other thing, I think one of the few sort of unified points of agreement among the conservative and sort of Republican party types is regulation, deregulation. Whatever conservatives feel about taxes, entitlements, and spending, et cetera, everyone agrees the regulatory state is a great burden. Importantly, it's a disproportionate burden on the working class. If you look at the sort of cost of regulation, say from the Small Business Administration's 2013, it's about $10,000 per employee, just the Fed regulations. But it's about $20,000 per employee if you're talking about manufacturing. It's vastly disproportionately affecting people who work with their hands, people who work in industry, people who work in mining, transportation, et cetera. We need to remove that burden, and that mainly means removing a lot of the environmental restrictions that are especially affecting energy, manufacturing, et cetera. About 50% of all the cost of regulation over the past 20 years has been environmental, and that's increasingly bringing minimal gains. So we're talking about approaching sort of like ambient air quality standards of ozone, et cetera, and yet we're spending tens of billions of dollars to try to achieve increasingly minuscule effects on air quality. And what's actually that's impacting is, again, mainly people who work with their hands and in factories and so forth. And finally, insofar as there's sort of taxes entitlement issue, one of the sort of hobby horses I've been riding for a while is this idea of netting taxes. A lot of people have different great ideas for programs, and a lot of people say, well, you know, we can't cut taxes because working class people don't pay that many taxes anymore. But that's forgetting FICA. If you're working in America, you're paying about 15.3% to the federal government for every dollar you earn. And when we're talking about providing those people food stamps, Medicaid, 101 plus transfer programs, mainly directed at the middle and poor class, why don't we just cut that out? Instead of giving them a new program, stop taking their money on one hand and then giving them with the other hand. We can remove an incredible bureaucratic burden on the working class, we can reduce the disincentives to work, and we can get rid of a lot of the bureaucrats that are administering this with absolutely no effect on actual income. So I think if you can kind of think about that sort of focus for an economic movement, netting out the taxes and transfers that disproportionately affecting the poor, deregulation, especially of environmental laws that increasingly have minimal effects, and getting inflation under control, having a Federal Reserve that's actually adhering to a mandate and has responsibility and accountability, then you're actually going to have something that's going to appeal to the working class in America.
That AEI does a lot of thought about this, particularly with respect to the working poor. Where are you thinking ought to? And that what Judge just gave us was a, I would say, very libertarian approach towards addressing the working poor and the oppression of the working class. What is AEI thinking about this issue?
Thank you. Got it. Thank you. And it's good to be here. I'm a big fan of all three of these and FREOPP, so it's great to be a part of this discussion. And like Henry, I've cared about this issue for a long time and have thought that people in the kind of classically liberal tradition need to be thinking more creatively about these issues. Probably like some of you personally, it's close to me just because my extended family on both sides of my family is more working class than not. I'm one of the outliers in the family, and so grew up with a lot of just kind of face-to-face exposure to those issues. I'll talk about some policy ideas in a minute when we come more to that. But one thing that I wanted to mention at the outset that's on my mind, excuse me, is the narrative around the working class that's been creates the boundaries within which public policy can actually be done. And one of the things we've been doing at AEI and what I've been doing in my own work is trying to dig down to see where the narrative's right and where it's wrong, because that actually takes you in right or wrong directions in terms of your policy solutions. And there are two sort of corrections, I think, that are in order for how we've been talking about the working class over the last 5 to 7 years. And the first one comes from survey data that we produced today. Yeah, we do these very large national surveys with the best survey research firms in the country. So we have gold standard data, large enough samples that we can actually drill down and make meaningful conclusions about some of the populations that are represented demographically. We have a definition of the working class that we use, that we developed with Brookings a few years ago. We spent an entire year in a very think tank kind of a way meeting to come up with a definition of the working class. So we pull that sample out of the larger surveys and have consistently found over the last few years, albeit up until this inflationary environment where we don't have the latest survey data, that working class Americans are actually much more optimistic about their future than you would think, or when it comes to traditional American values about the American dream, they hold those values more ardently than college-educated people on the left and the right. And so when you look at, for instance, working class Black and Hispanics, and you ask them about whether or not the country is headed in the right track or the wrong, going forward in the right direction, it'll be better in 10 years or it'll be worse in 10 years. They're much more likely to say better in 10 years than college-educated white conservatives are, for instance. And so the pessimism narrative about the working class being sort of alienated and anxious economically just keeps not showing up in the survey data. When you look at the fourth and fifth quintiles on the income distribution, but people without college degrees there, they're actually more confident in the ability of the average American to start and build a business than people in the very same quintiles with college degrees. So at least from the subjective outlook perspective, the notion of the working class doesn't necessarily match the narrative of the angry and alienated working class. And what's interesting is I see that in my own family. The second thing I wanted to say is on this opening point is that when it comes to the actual status of working class people in communities, and to what I just said at the outset, you might be like, that's fine. That's their subjective view. Maybe they don't really understand the economic environment within which they're living and working, and that would be a fair counterpoint. But I think that we've kind of over-focused on the aspects of China shocks when you have, to use the China shock term to basically as a broader umbrella for when the large company town goes away, you have a lot of working class people now as greeters at Walmart. No offense to people that do that for a living, but that's a big shift from working on the factory floor. There have been some really interesting studies that we can draw some really interesting conclusions from about that. But what I think is understudied is the way that stagnation in parts of the country where the working class have really been hit hard is the result of less dynamism rather than more. Usually the notion of churn, of firms starting, of firms dying, of living in a dynamic regional environment that has become essentially the opposition to what we want for the working class, that we want stability, security, and all the rest of it. But I think the best evidence that we do have is that working class people actually do pretty well when you have a dynamic regional economy where lots of things are going on. And when you layer survey data on top of that economic data, like Edmund Phelps, who won the Nobel Prize, and others who followed up with him have found, you find that the job satisfaction among hourly wage working class workers is actually higher in those types of economies. So I think we haven't actually thought enough about what the local economic environment actually produces for working class people. We've adopted a narrative very early on based on a couple of studies that I don't think holds for the broader population of working class people in the country.
Thank you. I completely agree that dynamism is extremely important. I would say that, zooming out, the most important thing to get right is the macroeconomic environment. And if we're going to take this literally, what is good for the working class is having jobs. And at the individual small scale level, employers are job creators. If you zoom out, it's consumers who are job creators because those businesses need customers. And so the most important thing to get right first, there are many other things to get right after this, but the first thing that has to be done correctly, if you care about, whether blue collar or just the working class as a whole or society as a whole, is making sure that there is enough spending in the economy to support the kinds of dynamism that you'd want, that encourages new businesses to form, that provides opportunities for people after old, dying, mature businesses die off. That if you don't have that right, no matter what else you do, you can have the best kind of regulatory environment or flexible labor markets or what have you, but it's not going to be sufficient if you don't get the macroeconomics correct. And I think relative to the overall goals of this conference, I think it's really important in terms of thinking about the social implications of getting this wrong. Thinking about Frederick Douglass being on the logo here, it was not the only reason, but I think a really important cause of or explanation for the blowback and failure in many ways of Reconstruction in the election of 1874 was the fact that there was a severe financial crisis in 1873, and the fact that the government was not able to and was not particularly capable of responding to that in a meaningful way, and that led to severe impoverishment across the country and a severe hardening of social attitudes. And you see this in many other societies as well. For anyone who is concerned about the preservation of liberalism writ large, it is very important to understand the importance of maintaining a solid macroeconomic foundation upon which you can then build and come up with improvements to regulations and taxes and other things.
You do your bit. Yeah. You could just be the moderator.
So let me just pose a couple of questions. First of all, none of you mentioned trade. None of you mentioned immigration. Would any of you care to respond to that? I mean, if there's one thing we can see, aside from you mentioning that we've overestimated the China shock, is that something that we need to think about?
So I have a book out in front called Trade Wars or Class Wars, so I would encourage you all to check that out for a longer version of this answer. But I think that it is very easy for people to misinterpret the loss of their industry or their job as being the fault of openness to trade more generally, as opposed to macroeconomic mismanagement both at home and in our trading partners. And I think that's an important distinction. Closing the United States to trade will not make us richer in general. What I think is important to understand, and sort of the flip side of this, is that there was a real China shock. We should not deny that the emergence of China as a major economic player was significant. But the reason it was significant was because, and this is something that has been mentioned elsewhere, is that the Chinese government is not interested in ensuring that workers in China are paid commensurate with the value of what they produce, and they're not free to earn what they should, to organize in a normal adversarial manner with employers, and to have money that they can spend on things that they want. And so the normal gains from trade that you would have expected, where we buy stuff from them, they buy stuff from us, it didn't work. We bought stuff from them, and they were not able to buy stuff from us. And that was what was so damaging. And yes, there are things that the US and other countries could have done unilaterally to offset that, but that was fundamentally the sort of global macroeconomic problem. So there's nothing wrong with trade per se, and imposing tariffs or other trade barriers wouldn't fix this problem. The problem is there wasn't enough global demand to offset the fact that what was happening with China. And that, I think, is it's a complex point. It's why it took a book to explain it. But this is, I think, a really important for anyone understanding the value of preserving the open system, which is we don't want to deny the fact that international trade and financial flows can lead to job loss, but we should also understand why that is and what the appropriate solution is. And simply saying that we're going to become an autarky or close ourselves off is not going to make us richer.
I'd largely want to agree with Matthew and just point out some numbers that about 50% of all of U.S. manufacturing produce, the production, is exported. And about 20% of all of our manufacturing is composed of parts imported from foreign countries. There is no way to disentangle the American manufacturing sector in particular from trade, and we shouldn't try to. Now, that there is a separate issue that I think we all acknowledge, that beyond the effects of trade, which are largely positive, there are legitimate geopolitical concerns, which the working class share, and for good reason, just like the AFL-CIO shared concerns about trade with the Soviet Union in the 1960s and the 1970s. There was a reason the unions were at the lead of opposing that increased trade. And if you look at that period, you should see correctly an incredible conservative opposition to continuing to trade. There are pictures in the 1960s of housewives burning products from the Soviet Union because they say we should not trade with an evil communist dictatorship. We have to, even though we are not going to totally disentangle with what is our third largest trading partner, I think we all recognize we're at a point where we cannot allow Communist Party-controlled companies to have significant shares of U.S. manufacturing. That's not good for our country in the long term. And there's other ways to create more trade with our allies, just like we did in the 1960s and 70s, as opposed to focusing on trade with a communist dictatorship. I want to hear Henry on it, too.
Yeah. Yeah, but I have to keep this open. I just think you're all wrong. I think it's wrong politically. It's quite clear. It was clear in the data before Donald Trump that what blue-collar workers wanted was protection against competition. They wanted protection from unfair competition from illegal immigration. They wanted protection from competition from what they thought was unfair competition from foreigners, and that when somebody came and gave them that, that's what they wanted. When you look at worker-based political movements elsewhere, they've always been based on some form of protection, whether it's worker safety protection against, or some sort of minimum wage or minimum hours protection against bosses in the 1930s, whether it's sort of welfare state provisions that workers' movements in the labor era, social democratic era wanted, or today, when you look at where workers are attracted in other parties, what they're looking for is some degree of protection. They like dynamism, they also want protection. And my view is if you're actually trying to talk to people politically, you have to not tell them why they're wrong and why they should like you, they'd be better served by your views, but you should try and actually speak to them about their concerns and see which of them have some value. And what I tend to hear is actually the views of working class voters on these things are automatically dismissed as wrong or valueless, which is, to me, not a particularly sound way of trying to build a party that is based on the working class. Hey, they asked me for my opinion.
I'll go ahead and respond. Yeah, I'll take one response to that. So I think, in large part, people do want protection, and I think that extends beyond the working class. I think, at least in our survey data, which I said is good survey data, you'll find the concerns about immigration more heightened and more intense among people that are more highly educated than people who are working class, which isn't to diminish the concerns that the working class have. Working class people want to know that they live in a country where their kids can start, build, and make a life for themselves no matter what they want. They want that. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't be doubly concerned about the kind of protections that they need to provide the secure base from which to do that. But I do think when it comes to this notion of the American dream and what kinds of policy solutions actually would help working class achieve it, their particular aspirations aren't a whole lot different than the mainstream. And we could have a debate up here about immigration policy for the rest of the day and probably all find different things to disagree about. But one thing that I wanted to mention as a policy idea that I am actually kind of more concerned about right now, and that is the fact that working class people are resource and network poor compared to probably everybody in this room, where we are kind of resource and network rich in terms of not just the monetary resources we have, but the information that we have. So information and networks are pretty rich in this room. When you're looking for new opportunities, you're looking for new jobs, you have a lot of people you can talk to. What a lot of working class people in this country do not have is access to labor market data and the regional economy where they live, and the ability to know where they can get the kind of on-ramp into that. And I think our workforce development system in this country has consistently failed this population for over 50 years. We've done a lot of K through 12 school reform. We've even done some successful higher ed reform. We've done nothing successful in this space. We have like 50 states running a federal policy and 50 different versions of the same bad thing. You have opportunities regionally that people just don't know about and they're not connected to, and it's easier to find the best Thai restaurant in your neighborhood than it is to figure out where you could actually go to get the kind of certification that you would need for the kind of job that you actually really want to have. We sort of take for granted our ability to get access to that kind of information, and that's just something that's not actually happening in working class America. So there's a job matching problem that, regardless of the effects of immigration on a particular community, over the last 10 years, there have been lots of opportunities in larger areas where working class people are that they're just not getting connected to. And I think that's where a lot of policy entrepreneurs who care about this issue should be focusing right now while we continue to debate immigration.
Either of you wanted to say something, and then I'm going to turn it open to the
Sure. I think that the goal of protection, broadly understood, is very reasonable, and I think that's the motivation behind social reforms going back hundreds of years, whether it's banning child labor or basic health and safety laws or the construction of the welfare state. The idea that the way you achieve protection for people in particular industries is preventing or putting some kind of penalty on imports from other countries, and that will be successful. I think we've seen a lot of evidence that that's not how it works. The idea that even banning immigration is particularly helpful is, again, not how it works. This is where I think it's useful to have sort of a macroeconomic perspective. Illegal immigration is a problem from the perspective of workers because illegal immigrants are treated poorly and are underpaid, and they do not have the same labor rights and labor costs of legal workers. That doesn't mean that immigration itself is bad for workers. More immigrants means more customers. That's ultimately going to be increasing the supply of labor, which might, you say, put downward pressure on wages, but also the demand for labor, which is why that's what most of the studies find. It's also, by the way, people who say that the solution to inflation now is to open immigration, I think is not going to be constructive. I mean, I'm not saying it's bad, but it's not going to be constructive for that same reason. It means more spending, more production, and more spending. Again, for thinking about the context of trade, putting on tariffs or other kinds of quotas on foreign imports, if that were something that would be successful for improving the well-being of people in most countries, we would actually see that being a much more popular policy, a much more common policy. But it's not something that happens. People do that, and they end up becoming worse off, not just because other countries will retaliate, but also because you've made the things that people would like to have cost more. You've reduced consumer choice. You've limited their freedom, and the protection you provided is ultimately, illusory. It may be beneficial to some of the people in the specific, preferred industries, but not for the society as a whole. The answer to unfair trade practices by other countries is not to simply limit imports entirely. It's to do what is necessary, either to ensure that they follow the trade practices that are appropriate and maintain the kind of standards that we want, or to have some sort of compensating benefits to Americans to offset the costs. But the idea that you simply penalize American consumers is not going to make them richer.
And I maybe just add to that point that we conservatives should not entirely dismiss the use of trade restrictions, Section 201, Section 301, et cetera, trade restrictions as a leverage tool to encourage other countries to open up. This is exactly what Secretary of Treasury James Baker did in the late 1980s under Reagan. It can be a successful tool if the end goal is opening up to a free trade, which it was back then. You can and must use some sort of leverage to do that, which means, at least in the short term, making some unfair trading partner forced to open up their own markets. And that can and should be done when necessary.
Okay, let's go to the audience for questions. Gentleman here.
I don't remember the other one, but I think beer was one, where we actually had our first rise in significantly paid manufacturing jobs of late, and it was, and one of them was in micro breweries, which I would have never, as everybody talks about, oh, we're going to build, we're going to build another steel mill, and you're thinking, oh God, this isn't going to work, this is a fake promise. But breweries actually, are diversifying and multiplying. And are you guys following industrial sectors that are, modular home assembly, other things that are on the rise and that might suit us from a comparative advantage perspective for blue collar work?
I've just been following a little bit, like most of you have, obviously, the semiconductor chip sector, which is an example of where I think we can already see the industrial policy was perfectly ill-timed, as it often is. They literally invested $50+ billion at the very peak of a semiconductor market, and now watching Intel, Qualcomm, and others cut tens of thousands of jobs in the interim, or we're going to leave with excess capacity, much like China does when they have a shipbuilding industrial policy, or when Japan does when they had the MITI control much of their industrial policy too. There are individual sectors that open up, and it's so often similar to my sort of netting taxes concern about the working class. Why, given the new program where you can just stop taking their money in the first place? To me, it's very odd. We spent a lot of time talking about how to subsidize semiconductors, and no one talked about the 2008 semiconductor hazardous air pollutant rule from the EPA that restricted how they could be built and how hard it was to build in America a new semiconductor plant. Like, there's a lot of restrictions that are making this hard, and they're disproportionately affecting manufacturing. There's a reason American manufacturing is about 10% of the workforce, and in much of Western Europe, it's closer to 18, 19%. A lot of that has to do with our overly intense restrictions on development and focus on kind of luxury goods qualities that are very amenable to people in urban centers and well-off people, but actually burden a lot of people who have to work with their hands in the construction, manufacturing, et cetera.
This is the first I've heard someone say that the U.S. should follow European lead on regulation.
Can I just add one quick point to that? In terms of the sectors themselves, one thing that's common across them is wherever there is real growth in kind of new manufacturing, it does require a certain type of aptitude and skill level that's just different than in the past. And I mentioned the broken workforce development system a while ago. When you go around the country and you see programs that actually do have really good outcomes, they almost exist in spite of federal policy. But what they have in common is that the sectors themselves actually invest resources. The people that are competitors but working in the same sector, usually in partnership with a community college or some training program. And one thing that we found is when you actually look at their curriculum, about a third of it would be devoted to what we would call non-cognitive skills as well. So so part of what we're not doing well is actually getting people within these sectors really equipped for whatever the growth requires. And it almost always requires a certain type of certification for what the job has, but it also requires the ability to solve problems, to work in teams, to lead and all of that kind of thing. And the best programs out there actually include that. There's absolutely no incentive in federal workforce policy to do that, but that's the reality of where it's working. And I agree with the brewery point. It's a great story. Great David and Goliath story of the last 25 years.
Okay, question here.
My question's for you, really, Henry, which is, has that demand for protection from blue-collar working class voters always been there, and Trump was like a political entrepreneur in reaching out to them? Or is it something that's developed over the past 2 decades, in which case, what is your explanation for why this is a more popular policy viewpoint these days?
I don't know. First of all, going back, there's when I think about political history, both here and in Western Europe, workers tend to want some type of protection against something that they can't handle on their own. Which is why they demanded unions and why they demanded fair working hours. 40-hour, statutory limitations on how much you can work, and time and a half for overtime was a government policy from the 1938 National Labor Relations Act. I know it pre-existed Trump because I've seen data from the latter part of the 2000s where blue-collar voters were overwhelmingly for that. I was writing about that before Trump ever got on the escalator to come down. So at least those specific issues were out there. They were the $100 bill on the ground that economists say you should never find because if markets were efficient, somebody would have picked it up already. Well, there are market inefficiencies. The political class refused to see what was in front of them, and Donald Trump, not being part of the political class, saw it and wrote it to the White House. But whether those same concerns existed in 1980-something, I don't have the data on that. Ross Perot tried to campaign on that and did well with respect to the giant sucking sound you hear as there's job going down to Mexico opposing NAFTA. But I don't specifically have data that can back that up. I just know that it existed among blue-collar workers very strongly years before Trump got involved.
And I would largely agree with Henry on that. The U.S. working class throughout most of its history was fairly protectionist. It was the farming class that was largely free trade, and that was the division. Up until, if you look about the 1930s, the Democratic Party, which when it began to absorb urban workers and unions into it, at the same time the U.S. became a manufacturing powerhouse, became the centerpiece of free trade. Republicans continued to be anti-free trade up till the first time there was a vote that was actually more Republicans voting for trade than Democrats was 1971. A textile tariff vote actually was the first time. But for a long period, because the U.S. was dominant, was trading, the centerpiece of the free trade was these unions through the GATT, the General Agreements on Trade and Tariffs in 1944, the Kennedy rounds and so forth. The unions, even though they had particular qualms with it, in general supported it. And I would just say as well, in England, it was the unions and the urban workers that were largely free trade against the protectionist, largely landowner and rural class right there. If you look going all the way back to the Corn Laws in 1846, it was mainly advocated by workers who were concerned about free trade, who were concerned about high prices of corn and grain and wanted to import that so they could feed themselves better. But, you know, it certainly has switched back and forth. It's not universal, and I agree with Henry that leading up to 2000, a lot of people were missing increased concern of the working class with trade.
One thing that's important to add to that we haven't mentioned yet is really just the way class-based segregation has proliferated in our country since that time that you asked about. So if you go back to 1985 and you look at the 15 most unequal cities in the country, measured by the distance between the top 10 and the bottom 10%, over half of them were in the South. You know, so this would have been 20 years after 1964. Still this legacy of Jim Crow, you know, hadn't worked all that out. And most of them were mid-sized metros, right? You fast forward to today, and it's all the cities you would think. The 15 most unequal include New York and Los Angeles and San Jose and San Francisco, none of which were in the top 15 in 1985. This city, Washington, D.C. And so what's happened is the distance between those who can afford to live there and those who cannot, there's a whole bunch of other stuff that cascades from that, right? There's the inability to afford housing. There's having to drive and commute a long way to a job that you want. And so that's a real recipe for the kind of resentment that can boil over time, because you're actually not integrated with people of different classes. They truly are an other. You don't know anyone not like yourself. And we sort of take for granted that it's happened in America. It's actually happened in our adult lifetime.
Questions? Any other questions?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, when you get to the blue-collar worker, I think over the years that they've felt that their government has sold them out. And to get them more prosperity, it seems like the government always wants to create more rules to help them. And they want to help specialized interests. And we're going to build a chip place here, we're going to do this here, we're going to build a cylinder, we're going to do all these different things. And it seems like over the years, the government response to helping out the blue-collar worker just makes it worse and worse and worse. And if we're talking about free economics and free markets, what is the government, is there any kind of possibility that the government can do anything to actually make that happen, or has the government just been too big and too bureaucratic to help the real worker?
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm taking that as directed at me. Yeah, there's tons of things the government could do. I just think we have an ideological blinder that refuses us to let us see it. But you know, I think the government has put its thumb on the finger of helping people like us. It subsidizes education that we benefit from. It turns a blind eye to illegal immigration so that we can afford services that we have the disposable income to use. It does not fund education and training for skills of the sort that those people would benefit in their jobs. We benefit low prices for consumer goods, which we have, and we have not encouraged labor mobility so that rather than allowing the market to react to labor shortages in different parts of the regions by raising wages that make it more attractive for domestic Americans to move to, it's cheaper for us to import people from overseas. So we have people who, in a economy that was actually trying to raise prosperity for everyone, you would probably see, if you can't just bring in 1 million people across the border from South America, that's the way we've done literally 1 million people in the last year, then you'd probably have to raise wages, and then it might be worth it for somebody to move from Duluth and take the risk. Instead, we have incredibly low labor mobility for people who don't have college degrees and high labor mobility for people who do. That makes perfect sense when you think that we have a welfare state that helps people not fall below a certain floor, which means there's a reservation wage to move, and we don't let the reservation wage actually rise because it's in our interest as wealthy, educated people to have cheaper goods and to bring people from overseas. No wonder they're resentful.
So there not going to really be any kind of meaningful changes based on the political climate at this point. Is that what you're saying?
I'm sorry?
The political climate in Washington, is there any kind of meaningful changes that are going to be able to help change that in the near future? Or what would
I think Matthew wants to close out the panel with his comment.
there actually has been significant progress. If we look back over the past 6-7 years, that in the aftermath of the financial crisis, you had a severe increase in inequality, and people at the lower end of the income distribution were adversely affected. But in the recovery from them from about 2016 onwards, we've actually seen a tremendous amount of wage compression, and particularly in the past few years, where wages at the lower end of the scale have actually grown much faster and much further than wages at the upper end. And we've seen, so everyone's wages have been going up, but wages at the lower end have been going much faster over the past few years. And in fact, when you look at the real wages in the aggregate, the performance, given the spikes in food and energy prices, have not been particularly good. If you zoom in on people and say the bottom quartile or the bottom half, their wage growth has been so much faster that it looks a lot, the picture is a lot different. And what we've seen, I think, what's the sort of common denominator of policy from 2016 onwards, more or less, has been the fact that for a variety of reasons, not necessarily intentional, that policymakers have been much more willing to ensure that there's been enough consumer spending in the economy to create the opportunities and the demand for workers to push those wages up. You saw that with the end of the sequestration and the tax cuts that were put in place in 2017. You saw it with the way the Federal Reserve reacted to their growth in 2018 and 2019. You saw it with the response to the pandemic and subsequent to that. And so whether or not it was conscious or not, that dramatic focus on aggregate growth ended up benefiting blue-collar workers disproportionately. And in fact, it makes the harms that those people endured before then look all the worse, because it makes it clear that we actually could have done something a lot different in the 2000s, but unfortunately we did not.
I'd like to thank the panel for the interesting discussion that we had, and I'd like to thank you all for coming, and we'll move on to the next panel.